Today's lesson is going to be on hair. And hair is a very complicated topic because all hair types are different. And I know I've been saying when we do portraiture, everybody is different. But hair is really such a diverse topic to talk about. So we're going to look at one sample and actually do it together so we can get some basic principles. We're also going to be writing down step by step how we kind of approach the hair. And then I'll show you some other samples where that applies and some special things to look out for at the end. So make sure that you title your page hair with the date, and as always you want to get out your pencils and blending supplies, and your eraser is actually going to be very important today. If you have a small eraser or a sharp eraser, those will be extra helpful. I like to do hair in graphite, but I also really like to do it in charcoal. So I don't personally care which one you use today. But we are only going to use the erasers, not really the white pencil if you have that. So today our first model is going to be here, and they have a nice kind of basic hairstyle for us to look at with different areas that we can address. So before we get started, first thing we want to do is draw the base of their head. So you really don't want to draw a head, or you don't want to draw a head of hair without the head part of it. So we want to start with that. So we will lightly sketch in, not a full face, but just a head for this to sit on. Think of like a wig head, essentially. So we have kind of our circle. We don't need to do the complex part of like going and doing another one. We're just going to cut this in half and cut that in half. Add from here to here the nose, and then we take that measurement down, and that's going to be roughly where the chin is. Then based on this model here, you can see where her mouth is compared to that jaw, so it's just about right there, and that's about halfway between her nose and her chin. So halfway between the nose and the chin, we're going to draw in her jaw. And having a somewhat accurate face shape is going to make a person look more like a person. Even if we're not drawing in their facial features, having just some of those basic proportions of their face is good. I won't be able to see her right ear, but I do see her left one. Remember, that goes from about the bottom of the nose to about the top of the eyes, so not quite at the brow line for me. And that's going to disappear, so I'm drawing that super light. For her neck, that's going to come out from her jaw. Can't really see the other side, but I'll lightly indicate it. Like that. And so I have a pretty light sketch of what I'd like my face shape to be. So I can really lighten that up, because that's not the focus for today. So no features, just making the shape of the head. So let's start. The first thing that we want to do when we approach a face is we want to find the hairline and the part, and then we want to break down into major shapes, and then we can do more minor detailed shapes. You also want to look at the front versus the back. So let's look at those things on our model. So first we're going to find the part and the hairline. So the hairline is where your hair starts on the head. So if you imagine like this is just her face, but she has an entire kind of skull going behind her. So that's why we do that kind of inner outer circle thing. So the hairline kind of starts for us where the end of the face is. So basically at the top of our head is where we want to start her hairline. And then at the part is where the hair kind of shifts or comes out of. So right here is where we notice that shift happening. So we have the hairline kind of over here. We can simplify that if we want to. Most hairlines are going to look kind of like this. Notice how She has a kind of higher forehead. And now we're going to draw that on our model. So first let's start with the hairline. We said it was kind of really high up. I like to give it a rough shape like this. So I see the distance where her brow line is and where the top of her head is. So really close to the top of that initial circle that we drew. Because there would be a little bit more around it, which we learned from when we did our face turn. Then we want to get in the part which is happening over here. And that's step number 1. Step number 2 now is that we want to break this down into some major shapes. So if I go in, I can see that there's this kind of small shape in here. Then there's this kind of chunk all on the left side. So notice this kind of wavy chunk on the left side. There's a little bit coming out at the back. So we want to differentiate the front from the back. So that's kind of curling in, so it has a little bit of lighting to it. You can see where to separate because the light changes so dramatically there. On the left side now, I have this portion, which is cutting up in the front. This kind of down here, and then you can see where the back is as well. So right back there. Areas you can see them a little bit better. So I've broken down that into some major shapes, and I've differentiated between the front and the back. So I'm going to draw that on my person. So over here, this kind of loops around, cuts down into the actual face itself, and then curves and ends roughly where her neck is. So I'm making sure that I get that initial curve right. So over the eyes, back a little, and then into the neck. On the other side, it's gonna follow her face, go down, it gets a little wider, so it follows that same curve that we had here. We're gonna add that there, and down. And in the back here, we have a little bit of a shape as well. So that's the right side now. Just that little. Okay, let's get the left side in. So there's this little area in the back, and then this kind of curves from her face outwards. Other side of it. Then we have underneath comes another shape. And this is way shorter. So notice that it ends kind of where her chin does. So I actually made that a little too long, which is fine. So I can just shorten that and then bring that there. So it's nice to have a model that you can double check to see if you've gotten all the proportions right. Okay. So that's roughly the major shapes of my hair. I know which parts are in the back. I can already kind of slightly shade those and indicate that they're further away from me by doing a tiny bit of shading, but not too much. Let's move on to our next steps. So once you've broken this down, you can identify the light source. And so you want to figure out when you're doing hair where light is hitting so that you can kind of block out the shading. So you're going to block out your highlights, your midtones, core shadows, and you're going to use gradients to do that. So on this next part here, let me switch to this color, and I'll get rid of that for now. So my light source I can tell is coming from here. If you can't tell based on the hair itself, which you should, you can kind of see that really bright area. you can tell by the other parts of the face. So you can see the shadow is mostly going to be on this side, coming out from under the hair. There's a lot of shading on that other side of her face. So since the left side is shaded, that means the light's probably coming from the right side. So I'll just indicate that. And then, as I said, after we have that, we're going to block out your highlights, midtones, core shadows, and we're going to use gradients. So it's easiest to start out, I think, with the back parts. So the back parts aren't really going to get a lot of lighting. You see that here, and you can see that over there where it starts to curve in behind the hair. So I usually like to start with those because they're very easy areas to figure out. And those are really dark because she has a good range of value in her hair. So I can start to really darken that. Over here, it gets a little lighter towards the ends, so I am going to use a gradient to help me. So start really dark and then eventually go lighter. Let me switch pencils. So those areas already seem to like push the face forward. I usually like to start wherever I see it's darker and then fade into where it's lighter. So right at the edge over here, I can see that there are some kind of darker areas. They eventually get light around there, and then they start to get darker around here. So I'll start at the top, very loosely putting in my gradient, and have that fade. The hair isn't white though, so I don't want to leave it completely blank. It's just going to be a little bit lighter where the highlight is. And I'm gonna add an additional kind of shape like this that I can see. So there's a front part that's sticking out to me. And I'm gonna shade those as well. So I see that it gets dark around here where it folds inwards. And over here. So that's the left side, and we'll definitely do more than this, but that's just what we want for now. Okay, then up at the top, I have that it's also dark around here. Kind of fades a little bit as it goes towards that light source. And the rest of this is pretty dark, but not quite as dark as underneath it. So again, some gradients coming up from under. Now I'll let you deal with that for a little bit of time. Now that we've kind of identified the light source and blocked things out, we can add texture to this. So I kind of like to do these steps roughly at the same time, but we're going to texture where the hair meets the skin and then add some strand texture as well to this. So let's look at where the hair meets the skin. For that, you're going to look really close, and you can see here. One of the most horrible things that I'll see is when you give people just straight kind of no transition between where the hair meets the skin. And that's really not going to happen unless their hair is cropped in like super short and even, and they took like a razor to it to make it that straight and suddenly coming out. Otherwise, you're going to have kind of texture and individual areas that eventually lead into the big parts of the hair. It's kind of like the eyebrows. So it's mostly going to be a texture, but way on the outside there should be some kind of stragglers, and that's what makes it look like things are attaching into the head naturally. So if I go in here, I'm gonna take the ends that I know are meeting the skin, and I'm gonna push them inwards like this. Also want to get kind of the side of the face. You can see some hairs coming out of the side of the face as well. So do that, and you want to be light about it. It's gonna like taper, so it's gonna go like that. The hair is pretty thin, and you don't want to treat it super dark like it's, you know, grass coming out. Now, as I do that, that will lead me to the texture of the hair itself. So if you look at the movement of the hair, you don't want it just to stick out randomly like this, but there's slight curves to it. And these curves are eventually going to turn into the curves that are occurring in the actual hair itself. So this one's going around kind of straight. This one curves inwards. So you want to get those. You don't want to just add spaghetti hair, and you don't want to make up stuff if you see waves, but you really want to look at it, especially if there's only a few of them. On the other side, we have kind of short hairs. They go out and down, and then these ones, as they get longer, will start to curve in. So you want to get all those motions of the hair as we do this strand texture to it. Let me see if I can switch pencils again. So especially where the core shadow is turning into midtones, that's roughly where you're going to have a lot of texture showing. Where it's really dark, you're hardly going to have any showing, but you should have a little bit. So if you need to take your eraser and lighten up areas that aren't supposed to be black, then you can certainly do that. So over here, I don't think that's quite black necessarily, even though it gets dark. I can always re-darken something. It's kind of harder to lighten it out though. So over there, I'll add some texture. I'm not going to be afraid to take my pencil and let that kind of fade though. And I'm gonna look for these individual strands here. So you can see some areas have special motion to them, and you want to add those in. So you're gonna go in both with your eraser and with your pencil to do that. So I'm adding some texture, especially where those midtones are, into where my core shadows are. Take my eraser, go back in. So that really adds to the sense of rhythm that we're getting in here. Again, these aren't dark lines, but they're really light ones. You really want to try and get the ends now. So over here, the ends of mine, I want to look more natural, so I'll start texturing those as well. Now let's do the other side. If we need to, we can take our eraser and get things lighter. So over here, I want my highlight to be a little stronger. Over here too. One of the things that I like to do, and this is optional, but I like to take my whatever blending stump that I have and just super lightly help out those areas. And that'll blend the texture that you have into the hair and make it look more natural. So I can roughly approximate that if I take my smudge tool and just lightly go over those areas. So you see as I go over, they get kind of blurrier, and that will be more natural. I don't want them to be that blurry, but I want to take from my shadows And I want to push those over just a little bit to smooth out that texture. You can always go back in and make the texture more or less apparent, and you can go back in with your eraser if you feel like you need to. So I'm going to keep adding those line movements all over. Take my eraser wherever I feel like I need it. So these hairs go down, these ones are going out. Start to go down there. Then I want to texture the bottoms. When I feel pretty good, I'll take my blending thing, and I want to blend in the same direction. So I'm not just going all over like this. That's not going to end up looking nice, but I want to really take either my blending stump or my paper towel really tight and follow the same movements. So if you follow the same movements, the blending will look a lot better and it'll naturally look like it belongs there, not like you just suddenly took some hair and made it look blurry. Okay. So I'm looking at this. I think I can make this highlight a little bit stronger. Going back and forth. So really we're at the details stage now. So last step is we want to draw and erase any more details. So you see me taking my eraser to that. And finally we're going to add some extra flyaway hair. So I'm going to take my eraser and go over any areas that are left over from my sketch. Anything that seems a little bit too harsh, especially around the edges where it starts to turn into the face. Go back in and add these kind of individual textures. If I see any like really cool defining strands over here, I see this really big area of darkness. So I want to add that in. I want to add this kind of darkness, everything to shift the shadows darker and get all the midtones to look more interesting. I'm gonna start doing that. So hair is kind of a labor of love, needs a lot of patience. If you're noticing something is sticking out, it's probably because it either has a highlight or it has shadow around it. This area here could be stuck out a little bit more. That area should look like it's in shading. Alright, so when I say there are individual flyaway hairs, let me get rid of all that stuff on our model from before. To make hair look super, super natural, there's going to be a couple of hairs that don't quite fit in. So you see they're going kind of all over her face, going outside, hitting more random directions, kind of relative to what the rest of the hair looks like. So you want to add a couple of those in, and those little flyaways are really going to add a lot to how this looks. So individualize some strands that you see, some clumps of strands, honestly. And don't be afraid to add a couple that don't quite look like they fit in. We don't want to go overboard with that, but just a couple of these really help with making the hair look more natural. We're always after a natural look, or at least almost always. Okay. So there we go. There is how to do hair. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to write out these 8 steps before we move on. So you find the hairline and the part, you break it down into major shapes, then minor shapes. Do you want to differentiate between the front and the back? Next, you want to identify the light source. You're going to block out highlights, midtones, and core shadows with gradients. Once you have those gradients in, you can start to texture them. So texture where the hair meets the skin, that's a good place to start. And then you can start to add that strand texture, but you want to make sure that you're getting the right movement. At this point, you can also do a little bit of blending. And you can add more details, so draw them in and erase them. So pump up areas that are in shadow and use your eraser to lighten up areas that need more highlight to them. So you want some strands to look individual so that you get the general shape and the general gist and texture as well. So once you have those details, the last thing I would do is add that extra kind of flyaway hair. I don't want to add that too far in the beginning, but that's like a nice little finishing touch. So I'm going to show you how these steps apply to different types of hair. And different types of hair are going to require us to do different things. So let's look at a male example who also has kind of straight, maybe some wave to it. So as we look at this gentleman here, you can see that I've blocked in where his head will go. Let's start with step number 1. So you find the hairline and break it down into major shapes. So I found his part and a couple of different areas since his hair is going in all these directions. Next, we figured out where the light source is. It's at the top, and I started to add gradients to there. So I really pay attention to where it's dark and where it's light. After you have that, we start to add texture, so you can see I've connected to where his actual face is. That gives us a better idea of the hairline. And I mapped out the direction his hair was going in, so you can start to see me add lines like that. Finally, I went in with my eraser. I really like to take the edge of an eraser to get out those really light strands. And then I kind of added those flyaways at the end. So that's one example for you. Now let's look at a different texture of hair. So the person that you see here has a much different treatment to her hair. And one of the mistakes that I see with this when we have kind of curlier hair like this is we do these random kind of loop shapes, or we oversimplify the shape of it. So yes, we are going to start with a very simple shape. So we want to block out the proportion of her hair, sure. But then after that, when we start to get into the light source part and the gradient part, notice that the shapes I'm making aren't super sharp, but they do have some like clumps of circles. So we want to have that kind of shape and use the side of your pencil to make them really soft. So I have roughly where the light is, roughly where the dark is. There's some amount of gradient. The sun's kind of really bright here, so you could, if you want to, just do a light and then do a dark. Then eventually take your eraser to address those medium areas. When we do the texture of the strands on this one, we're using really soft coils and the side of our pencil to grab those. This is where charcoal is really fun to do. We're also starting to see any individual hairs or individual clumps of hair. So you can see that going along here. We don't want to make those all look like a singular area, but we want to define each one, at least roughly, so we get the general shape of it and the separation of those strands. And then we can go in with our eraser to bring in the highlights, see if there's any areas that we can make more distinct. And with this, as we're adding our texture in there, we want to make sure that our lines have a variation in their width. So you have like a singular line like that. which we want to kind of turn into something that has like a thickness to it. So on the left sides, we're going to be a little thinner. On the right sides, as they go down and swoop down, we can be a little bit thicker. And that's going to look more natural for some of the areas that you're going to see where the curls are a little bit looser and not so tight. So we don't want to have a texture that looks unnatural like that. After this, you can even add some more like little strands to it. Now, we're going to look at a sample of really curly hair, but looser than the last one that we saw. So these are more individualized strands. Same thing, we block out the shape. If you see any individual ones hanging like that, then you can kind of indicate them with just some lines for the direction because you don't want to forget them. We'll block out, find the light, and then we'll start to add that strand texture. I really don't want to see any super simplified curls like this, but we want to go back and forth and figure out like where to make it thick on one end and then where to make it thinner. So you can have kind of looser ones or you can have kind of tighter ones wound together, but they still shouldn't look like scribbles. And then I go in and I add more. This is really great if you have a thin eraser. You can erase out lighter parts of this and that'll be really fun, which is what I did over here with my kind of light strands. I took the corner of my eraser and I really tried to make sharp, nice highlights in there. So there are so many different types of hair that I wish I could show you to do, but that would take forever. I did want to give special shout out to when you have braids, which are gorgeous. We don't want to see any of these happening like hearts or circles, diamonds. This last thing is just a bunch of X's, which looks terrible. So with braids, just like with curves, you want to, or with curls, you want to make sure that you're actually looking at a pattern of something. And there are plenty of tutorials out there on how to do cool braids. We have so many different hair types, and depending on your person, we want to pay attention to just a couple more items. So there's going to be times where your hair is like up or it's tied back in some way, and when your hair is tied back, that really pulls a lot of the angles outwards. So you see that in that section over here, we really have that sense of it pulling. So we have the hairs being pulled back and then in these directions back and forth away from the face. Then we have different types of texture where lighting is going to really play in. So you could technically do all of this and like fill it all in pretty dark and then take your eraser and give it these soft, lovely textures to individualize, and then they'll start to get a lot lighter as we go down. So we really want to differentiate and make sure that we're not oversimplifying like we are here, but that these look super organic and not really totally even. So notice all these kind of spikes happening in an unpredictable kind of way. So really want organic lines. For hair that's a little bit closer to the face, so you can see kind of shaved areas here, they're going to be a clump of these textures. This is where I kind of like to blend, and it takes a little bit of patience to do that. We don't want to just scribble in our hair, but it's mostly like a shading with texture to it. As hair gets longer, you can start to see a little bit more of the movement that's happening in there, and you still want to do that even if the hair is short. So you want to get where it's kind of spiky and where the hair is kind of curling in. It will still do that even if it's pretty short. Moving onwards, if you have something that looks more like dreads, you'll have these kind of individualized areas, and you want to make sure that you're treating them that way versus areas that you can kind of clump together with some shading. So notice over here, I can't really tell them apart, so I would just shade them, but then I would get more individualized at the bottom. Same thing will happen if you have braids. So on here you can see very individualized strands that need their own texture. You can see the part of here, and you can see where it shifts into a completely different texture. So when you see that, you want to give hair different treatment. And then finally, I think we're going to see a lot of kind of twists. That's pretty popular in hairstyles. And when we do twists, we again don't really want to treat them like curves like this. We also don't want to just give them kind of random waves like that. But you want to look at the way that it's twisting, usually at an angle downward. So we're going to have a lot of these kind of twisted leaf shapes just piled together in different lengths and different widths. And that will look a little bit better, so you can see that. On the other side as well, we have these kind of bigger, looser waves and curls that have these twisted shapes to them. So please pay attention to these amazing things that you're seeing as you're looking at different textures and styles of hair. Thank you, everyone. Now it's time for you to practice.